Even if you've never seen Disney's iconic 1940 version of Pinocchio, everybody has heard of Jiminy Cricket. A manifestation of one's own conscience, Jiminy Cricket is meant to remind us all of the importance of doing the right thing no matter what, as well as assure us that even if nobody else in the world cares about you, that little voice in your head always will. Now, whether you think that's a wonderful message or just see it as overly sentimental goo, there's no denying that Jiminy Cricket has transcended the movie he came from to not only become one of Disney's official mascots, but also the go-to depiction for consciences everywhere. And not to mention, his iconic rendition of When You Wish Upon a Star has also gone on to be the flagship song for the Walt Disney Company. So, to put it simply, Jiminy Cricket has most definitely left his mark on the world. But what about the man behind that iconic voice? What was his story? Well, that is a tad more complicated, and not to mention ultimately more tragic than Pinocchio. And today, I'd like to give a little history lesson on who this man actually was and what ultimately happened to him. Now, please do note that I don't claim to be an expert on this man's life, so this won't be a deep dive analysis, and that this video is simply meant to cover the basics of his life story. And please also forgive me if I get one or two things wrong. Okay. So with all of that out of the way, let's get right into it. Alright, so in case you didn't already know, Jiminy Cricket was voiced by a man named Cliff Edwards. Now, these days, Jiminy Cricket is hands down his most iconic and well-known role, though this wasn't always the case. In fact, he's sometimes even labeled as the first quote-unquote celebrity to lend his voice to a Disney character. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. Let's backtrack a bit. So, born in Missouri in 1895, Edwards was noted to be a gifted musician from an extremely early age, to the point that he quit school and left home at the age of 14. Now, for most people, this would be the worst decision they could ever make, but Edwards, it seems, was just destined for great things. He sang in saloons to make a living, as well as played the ukulele, which quickly earned him the nickname Ukulele Ike, a moniker he would carry for the rest of his life. Now, proving to be a huge hit with the patrons, Edwards soon found himself performing to huge success in vaudeville. Now, just for those of you who don't know, vaudeville was a kind of stage show where entertainers would show off their various talents to the audience. It could be comedy, singing, dancing, juggling, or anything else you could really think of. And among the most popular of these shows were the Ziegfeld Follies, which was basically the vaudevillian equivalent of Broadway. Vaudeville was most popular during the Roaring Twenties, but pretty much died out with the advent of sound movies. But I'm getting off topic again. Let me get back on track here. So the point is, Edwards found huge success in vaudeville as Ukulele Ike, and not only made it into the Ziegfeld Follies, but even to a degree on Broadway. And he was hands down one of the most famous ukulele players of his time, with his influence on the instrument extending even to this day, and also introduced several iconic songs, including Singing in the Rain. He also wrote several songs himself, but that wasn't one of them. So in essence, Edwards was on top of the world in the Roaring Twenties, both as a singer and a performer. He was even largely responsible for the sudden popularity of the ukulele, which once again still persists to a degree to this day. But simply put, audiences loved him and he had plenty of talent to give them. But unfortunately, his immense success and popularity wouldn't last. And it finally came to an end with the Great Depression. Though surprisingly, Edwards wasn't actually ruined by the 1929 stock market crash. He had plenty of money and had earlier in the year signed a contract with MGM. And they certainly delivered on it all right, placing Edwards in 33 films between 1930 and 1933, though mostly as a specialty item to showcase his musical talents, as they were sometimes known to do with popular performers back then. Though he did also manage to land real roles in a few films as well, proving that he had a talent for acting on top of everything else. He even managed to land a speaking part as an off-screen soldier in Gone with the Wind during the hospital scene. And it was around this time that he got what would become his most iconic role. You see, while Edwards had been fading in popularity since 1932, with his music largely falling out of style, he was still famous enough that Walt Disney sought him for the role of Jiminy Cricket in Pinocchio, hoping that Edwards' involvement would be a draw for audiences. And Edwards was more than willing to do it, delivering a performance that's still widely remembered and beloved today, as well as getting to introduce one of the most famous songs in Disney history. In fact, this pairing of Disney and Edwards worked so well that they teamed up again for Dumbo, though this time Edwards had a smaller role as the leader of the Crows who sings "When I See an Elephant Fly." But after that, the two pretty much went their separate ways, happy with what they had done together. Unfortunately, Edwards found no success after this. Though he tried several different ways to reconnect with the public, including trying to start his own TV show, they all ended in failure. And just as unfortunately for Edwards, retirement wasn't an option either, as he had no money to retire with. You see, Edwards made millions during his heyday in the Roaring '20s, but he wasn't a careful spender. Quite the opposite, actually. He had a love of partying, gambling, and drinking. So, as a result, he was in constant need of large sums of money in order to fund his lifestyle, and after the Great Depression hit and he started declining in popularity, he found it harder and harder to obtain these funds. And what also didn't help was that he had married 3 times, and by 1936 they had all ended in divorce, with Edwards required to pay alimony to all 3 wives. So, needless to say, he had taken the role of Jiminy Cricket for reasons beyond just liking the part. So with one failure after another and unable to command the paychecks he had before, Edwards started turning even more to alcohol, which obviously did nothing to help his situation. By the early 1950s, Edwards was broke and forgotten. He continued to record and sell records, but most didn't sell too well, meaning he couldn't really profit or directly benefit from them. At this point, living in a poverty home for actors and not having too many friends left to turn to, Edwards went back to Walt Disney, who was one of the few willing to help him out. As a result, there were many shorts released throughout the 1950s starring Jiminy Cricket, which were made pretty much just as an excuse to give Edwards a paycheck. He also managed to befriend quite a few people who worked for Disney at this time, and would even sometimes entertain them by telling stories of his golden days in vaudeville. Still fighting alcoholism, that was pretty much how Edwards spent the rest of his life. Going into the 60s, his health started deteriorating, and with no money of his own, Walt Disney paid for many of his medical expenses. And after Disney died, his company continued to quietly financially support Edwards, along with a few other organizations that supplied broke actors with money. Edwards died in 1971 of a heart attack, still penniless and pretty much forgotten by the public. With no family, his body was donated to a university, but to see that he got a proper burial, the Walt Disney Company offered to pay for his funeral. However, in the end, it was the Actors Fund of America, an organization that had helped support Edwards, that ultimately made the funeral arrangements. But the Disney Company still paid their respects by paying for Edwards' tombstone, even making sure it bore the name Ukulele Ike in addition to his real name. Nowadays, Cliff Edwards is only remembered by most for having voiced Jiminy Cricket in Pinocchio, and are totally unaware of his immense popularity as Ukulele Ike. Other than that, he's really only known by musician enthusiasts, and especially ukulele lovers, as well as musician historians, who have well documented Edwards' rather large influence on the 1920s music and his immense popularity in that era. But in the end, his legacy remains firmly tied to Pinocchio and Jiminy Cricket, as his only posthumous award came in 2002 when his recording of When You Wish Upon a Star was inducted into the Grammy Hall of Fame. Outside of that, his reign in the 1920s remains pretty much unspoken about outside of those aforementioned circles, and those aren't many people. So, to put it simply, Cliff Edwards' life was one that was marked by huge success, followed by just as immense failure, and when his alcoholism and inability to plan ahead basically cost him everything, he pretty much had to rely on the generosity of Walt Disney just to stay alive. It's the kind of story that's been told way too many times in the entertainment industry, unfortunately. The good old rise and terrible fall. But even with how his story ultimately ended, he still managed to contribute quite a bit to the Roaring Twenties as well as to the Walt Disney Company, and will continue to live on as the voice of everybody's conscience in the form of Jiminy Cricket. Okay, that pretty much wraps everything up. So now I'd like to hear what you have to say. Are you surprised by the storied history of Jiminy Cricket's voice actor, or did you already know all about his rise and fall? Please feel free to share what you think in the comments. And let me just once again clarify that I don't claim to know everything about Cliff Edwards, and that it's possible I got one or two things slightly off here. And as I said before, this was only meant to be a brief lesson on the man's life, not an in-depth look at it. And thank you all for watching. I really appreciate it, and I hope to see you all next time.